The verdict had already been spoken, long before any plate touched the table. In an interview circulated quietly through culinary circles, a respected French judge dismissed Filipino food with single word, unsophisticated. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. It was worse than that. Calm, confident, final. For decades, French gastronomy had defined refinement, and this judgment felt routine, almost invisible. But what followed would not be routine. A controlled experiment, a blind evaluation, and a moment that would force one of Europe's most respected palates to confront a conclusion he never expected to reach. The judge's name was Etienne Moreau, a fictional composite of the old guard of European culinary authority. Trained in Lyon, refined in Paris, and celebrated across Michelin panels, Moreau represented an institution, not just a man. His reputation rested on precision, restraint, and hierarchy. Cuisine, to him, evolved upward. Peasants to palaces, simplicity to sophistication. Filipino food, he claimed, had skipped steps. Too chaotic, too loud, too informal. His remarks were framed as professional critique. But to chefs outside Europe, they echoed something older. The idea that refinement had a passport and flavor needed permission. Thousands of kilometers away in Manila, the comment reached a smaller audience, but it reached the right one. Mara Villanueva, a fictional Filipino culinary researcher and former street food cook, watched the clip late at night. She did not react with anger. She reacted with precision. Mara had spent years cataloging indigenous techniques, fermentation, acid balancing, slow reduction, long before they were renamed by Western kitchens. She knew the problem wasn't flavor. It was framing. Filipino food was rarely judged without context. So she proposed removing context entirely. Mara's idea was simple and dangerous. A blind evaluation, hosted under neutral branding, featuring dishes prepared using Filipino techniques and profiles, but stripped of cultural identifiers. No names, no origin stories, just plates, temperatures, textures, and balance. The tasting would be framed as an international comparative panel. Through professional intermediaries, Etienne Moreau was invited. He accepted without suspicion. To him, this was another panel, another confirmation of standards he had defended for decades. He had no idea Filipino food was about to speak without introduction. The event took place in a converted chateau outside Bordeaux, a familiar ground for European tastings. Marble counters, neutral lighting, silence between courses. Moreau arrived composed, carrying the confidence of a man who had never been surprised by flavor. The panel included sommeliers, chemists, and culinary academics. The rules were strict. No discussion until written evaluations were complete. No guessing origins. No prompting. Dishes would be judged on structure, harmony, technique, and emotional impact. Moreau smiled. These were the terms he trusted most. The first dish arrived unannounced. A dark, glossy reduction with subtle acidity, paired with a protein slow-cooked to collapse under pressure. Moreau tasted, paused, and wrote carefully. Controlled fermentation. Intelligent use of acid. Unexpected restraint. He scored it high. The second dish followed, a broth layered with bitterness, salt, and umami, finished with an aromatic heat that lingered rather than burned. Moreau leaned back slightly. He did not smile. He did something rarer. He reconsidered. By the third dish, something unsettled him. The techniques were sophisticated but unfamiliar. The flavors did not align with known European schools. There was no butter-forward finish, no classical French structure, yet the balance was undeniable. Moreau's notes became longer. He used words he rarely wrote: memory, depth, ancestral. He assumed these were experimental Asian-European hybrids, perhaps Scandinavian reinterpretations. He was wrong. Every dish that challenged him came from the same unseen source. Midway through the evaluation, Moreau requested water and silence. This was unusual. Judges were trained to suppress emotion, but the plates were doing something disruptive. One dish in particular, a seemingly simple combination of sour and savory, triggered a pause that lasted nearly a minute. Moreau finally wrote, "This cuisine understands hunger." It was not a compliment he gave lightly. Hunger, to him, was the beginning of all gastronomy. This dish spoke from it. The tasting concluded with a final plate. Layered textures, minimal presentation, profound finish. No flourish, no ornament. Morrow placed his pen down slowly. His final score was among the highest he had given that year. When evaluations were collected, the panel's aggregate ranking revealed a pattern. The top 4 dishes unanimously came from the same kitchen. Only then did the moderator ask a single question. Would you like to know the cuisine of origin? Morrow nodded, confident but curious. He expected a revelation, perhaps a new European movement or a rebranded Asian fusion lab. The moderator paused, then answered calmly. These dishes are Filipino. The room shifted. Morrow did not respond immediately. He looked again at his notes, at his own handwriting. Unsophisticated was not among his words. He had written disciplined, mature, honest. The contradiction was undeniable, and worse, it was personal. Morrow asked for clarification. He wanted to know whether the chefs had trained in France, whether the techniques had been modified for European palates. Mara stepped forward then, revealing herself not as a provocateur, but as a curator. She explained that the techniques were indigenous, that fermentation, acid layering, and protein preservation had existed for centuries in Filipino kitchens. What changed was the framing. No story, no stereotype, just taste. The room stayed quiet. Morrow was not angry. He was exposed. For years, he had believed sophistication was visible, plated, named, explained. Yet his own evaluations contradicted his public statements. He had trusted the food when he didn't know its origin and dismissed it when he did. This realization did not destroy his authority. It tested it. And in that test, he faced a choice: defend the hierarchy or admit its limits. Morrow requested a private conversation. Cameras were absent. No statements prepared. He asked Mara a single question. Why has this cuisine never been presented this way? She answered simply, because it was never allowed to be. Filipino food had been introduced through nostalgia, poverty, or novelty, not mastery. It had been explained before it was tasted, apologized for before it was judged. The blind evaluation removed the apology. Weeks later, Morrow published a follow-up essay in a respected culinary journal. He did not retract his earlier comment. Instead, he dissected it. He described the blind evaluation in detail, exposing his own assumptions. He wrote that sophistication was not a trait of cuisine, but of attention, that unfamiliar structures were often mistaken for lack of discipline. He did not center himself as a hero. He centered the error. The essay circulated quietly at first, then widely. Culinary schools debated it. Critics resisted it. Some accused Morrow of virtue signaling. Others accused him of betrayal. But younger chefs read it differently. To them, it wasn't about Filipino food alone. It was about who got to define excellence, and how often that definition had been protected by ignorance disguised as expertise. Mara did not seek interviews. She returned to her work, documenting regional Filipino techniques without translation. She believed the blind evaluation was not a victory, but a correction. Filipino cuisine did not need validation. It needed accuracy. The dishes had not changed. The judge had. And in that shift, something subtle happened. Other panels began experimenting with blind tastings. Other cuisines began appearing without explanation. Morrow's reputation did not collapse. It evolved. He became known not as a judge who insulted a cuisine, but as the one who publicly confronted his bias. That distinction mattered. Authority, when challenged honestly, can expand rather than fracture. In later panels, Morrow insisted on blind first rounds, not to be progressive, but to be precise. The most telling moment came months later, during another tasting. A dish arrived that reminded Morrow of that first Filipino broth. He wrote fewer words this time. He trusted the silence. When origins were revealed, the dish was Peruvian. Morrow smiled faintly, not because he was right, but because he no longer needed to be. This story is fictional, but the pattern is real. Culinary hierarchies have long favored visibility over substance, familiarity over complexity. What we call unsophisticated often means untranslated. What we call refined often means familiar. Blind evaluation removes comfort. It forces the palate to work without permission. Filipino food, like many global cuisines, was never lacking structure. It was lacking space. Space to be tasted without context. Space to be judged without apology. When that space was created, the verdict changed, not because the food improved, but because the evaluation did. Authority is not dangerous because it judges. It is dangerous when it stops listening. H.M. Moreau listened too late, but not too late to matter. His shift did not rewrite history, but it interrupted a pattern. And sometimes, interruption is enough. In kitchens across the world, chefs continue cooking without panels, journals, or verdicts. They cook for hunger, memory, survival. Sophistication lives there, whether recognized or not. The blind tasting did not elevate Filipino food. It revealed it. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath the spectacle, that when identity is removed, truth often arrives sooner. That taste, when stripped of story, becomes honest. And that some verdicts only change when the judge cannot see who he is judging. The chateau outside Bordeaux still hosts tastings. New judges arrive. New cuisines rotate through. But one rule remains. No origins until the end. It is not tradition. It is correction. Because once you realize how often you were wrong, you stop being afraid of being corrected. Filipino cuisine did not need to be defended. It needed to be heard. And in silence, it spoke clearly. What changed that day was not a verdict, but a lens. And once a lens shifts, the world rarely looks the same again. This documentary-style story is a work of fiction, created for storytelling purposes, but reflect a real, ongoing conversation about bias, authority, and how often truth is hidden behind assumptions we mistake for expertise.